Hello, Midas Touch Legal AF family. It is great to be with you. Alex Aronson here from Court Accountability Action, joined by everybody's favorite, Michael Popok, and our friend Abdul Dosunmu from our partner organization, Y Block. That's the Young Black Lawyers Organizing Coalition. Abdul is a civil rights lawyer and a movement organizer and founded Y Block a few years ago. They're doing such amazing stuff, organizing Black law students, young Black lawyers to build movement power and protect Black communities from a lot of the stuff that we talk about here on this show so often. The assault on freedoms being leveled upon us by these corrupt MAGA justices and lower court judges across the country. Abdul, welcome to Legal AF. We're super excited to have you here.
It's so great to be here. I'm such a fan, and I never imagined that I would actually be on with you guys. So I'm just having a big moment right now.
I'm gonna turn it back on you. You and your organization, I think, is the reason we founded the Legal AF channel, to bring on voices like yours that were sorely missing in kind of the YouTube world. And as soon as Alex said to me, "What do you think about Abdul in Y Block?" I was like, you had me at what about? I mean, I was so, having then quickly looking you up. We'll talk later about, give you opportunity to talk about your organization and your role doing God's work as a civil rights lawyer and all of that. But thank you for being here because just Alex and me talking, it doesn't do it. We need Abdul. We need you to be on here regularly. Okay.
I'm happy to be on regularly, a recurring co-host.
All right. Well, we wanted to make sure to have you on this week because your organization and ours at Court Accountability, we just released a new report highlighting the harms done to Black communities across the country by this Supreme Court MAGA majority's reactionary, regressive agenda. We'll share a link to that report in the show notes here. But Abdul, you want to talk to us about what this report gets into and why we thought it was so important to get out there?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, again, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. Our core mission at Y Block is to really educate and organize Black communities, to build power, to sort of redirect legal orthodoxy in this country toward a more progressive and racially just North Star. And in part of our work is really making sure that communities understand the way in which the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, have been weaponized against Black communities. We've seen a whole range of Supreme Court decisions, but I think we sometimes, those of us who watch this podcast all the time, right? Like we sometimes don't appreciate that everyday folks are not following this stuff as closely as we are. What we wanted to do was create a resource that communities could use, that community leaders could use, that organizers could use to educate folks in the community about the harms that the Supreme Court has inflicted upon our communities. And so we go deep, but we don't get too complicated. We want this to be accessible and digestible to everyday folks. We go deep on all of those harms over the course of the last few years. We look at reproductive rights, right? I mean, we know the Dobbs decision was devastating for women across the country. And we also know that decision was disproportionately devastating for women of color and for Black women who live, 57% of whom live in states that have deeply regressive abortion bans in place, thanks to the Dobbs decision, unfortunately. And so we talk about that. We talk about the impact of the Dobbs decision on Black women across the country. We talk about voting rights, right? Look, we believe that if you look at the right-wing project in this country over the course of the last 40 years, much of it has centered around dismantling Black voting rights. Because as we like to say at Y Block, Black ballots are Black futures. And if you undermine Black electoral voice, you are that much closer to undermining Black futures. And so that has been a central project of the right wing in this country, and in particular in the judiciary. And so we talk about Shelby County v. Holder, and not just Shelby, but we talk about the ways in which, again, there's been a kind of steady march toward Shelby, and the way in which it has dismantled the Voting Rights Act and facilitated the rise of some 440 voter suppression laws and policies proposed across the country over the last.
Well, Abdul, let me interrupt with a question. Why that may be on people's minds. Why has the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act and hollowing it out been such a central tenet of conservative slash the Federalist Society? Why? Because it's
Yes,
obvious it
look,
is.
if you break down inclusive democracy, right? If you undermine the ability of multicultural, multiracial voices to be part of our democracy, then you have a straight shot at implementing an agenda that is regressive. And so, it's important to understand that they view our voting rights, they view our inclusion in our democracy, they view, full inclusion of Black folks in our democracy as a threat to their agenda, right? And so the core here is, if we break down Black voting rights, we break down, a racially just progressive agenda in this country. Because let's be honest, and let's be mindful about this. Black people have always been at the center of making this country more progressive. Black people have always been at the center of moving this country toward that more perfect union, right? And if they can limit our involvement, limit our inclusion, they can halt progress toward that more perfect union. And so there is no. It's clear why they started 40 some odd years ago, trying to, and especially Chief Justice Roberts, trying to break down the Voting Rights Act. And that has been a core theme over the course of the last 40 years. And there's no, it's clear to me how that journey, that work, led directly to Dobbs, led directly to the dismantling of affirmative action, led directly to some of the harms that we walked through in this report.
And really, it led to a Senate that has enabled this court. The Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate that confirmed all these extremist justices during the Trump years, may not have been there, but for the voter suppression that the MAGA court unleashed, that allowed states like Texas to stay consistently Republican. Right? You're coming to us from Texas. We're looking at a incredibly close Senate race. But there's a massive regime of voter suppression that has been greenlit by the MAGA justices on the Supreme Court. And it's not just voter suppression, right? It's also other aspects of voting rights protections that protect the voting power of Black communities, broadly speaking, like the voting rights prohibitions on gerrymandering and other prohibitions on gerrymandering, which have produced deeply unrepresentative Congresses throughout the years, and that make it harder for the people to have their will
Alex,
reflected
for our
in
audience,
the
why don't you
laws and in their
use South
government.
Carolina as an example and do a little teachable moment here on gerrymandering?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple years ago, the court handed down this partisan gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering case out of South Carolina. It was called Alexander, and historically, a few years before that, in a partisan decision called Rucho, the court decided that political gerrymandering was a non-justiciable political question. This is a sort of an excuse for the court to say, we can't get involved here. It's just too hard for the court to step in. I mean, of course, the court is happy to step in on all manner of important and very thorny and very political, complicated uh, constitutional questions. For instance, giving Trump powers of a king this year in the immunity case. But all of a sudden, when it comes to gerrymandering, which is disproportionately used by Republican state legislatures, to advantage themselves both at the state legislative level and at the congressional level. They had to have their hands off it. And then a couple years later, there was still an ability for challengers under the Voting Rights Act, for the Department of Justice, for private parties to challenge racially motivated gerrymanders. And what the court did in Alexander was declare that effectively racial gerrymanders are okay um, as long as the legislature can articulate some other justification for it, such as the fact that it might be a partisan gerrymander. So, of course, as Abdul mentioned, the black voting power has led to progress. It tends to align with support for capital D Democrats. And so it's not so hard for reactionary state legislatures to racially discriminate against black voters in their line drawing process and say, "Oh, nope, there's nothing the courts can do about it because all we're doing is gerrymandering based on partisanship," which shouldn't be permitted anyway.
And let me just say this, part of what we want to do through these resources is we want to mobilize the community. We've been uh, activating Black law students all over the country for the last few weeks in this election. And they have been educating Black communities about the courts. That's the word. We've been going into Black barbershops, going into Black churches, hosting voter education sessions about these very issues so that folks understand that not only is this election critically important, right, from the standpoint of the courts, because the next president will likely make probably hundreds of appointments to the federal courts. There are state Supreme Court seats on the ballot in 83 state Supreme Court seats on the ballot across the country, local judicial elections, right? So not only is that important, but we also want people to understand that we need to build a movement in this country around holding the courts accountable. We need to build a movement in this country that ensures that our coalition, the progressive coalition, takes the courts just as seriously as the right does.
That's so great to hear that you're doing that, Abdul. Because and as we get into this report, I think the connections between people's real lives, right? Because not like those folks in those barbershops are sitting around every day thinking about what the Supreme Court's doing. People are too busy. Life is too hard. It's too hard to make ends meet in the world for folks to be, thinking about the Supreme Court every day. And in our view, this is really by design. The outsourcing of this toxic, super unpopular agenda to unelected judges who dress up their policymaking in the language of constitutional law. It creates this huge separation between what they're doing and the impacts that are being leveled on people's everyday lives. And so, it's just amazing to hear that you guys are out there organizing, having those conversations, building that community awareness and those connections.
Absolutely. And what we hear consistently is we didn't know this was happening. Nobody's talking about this in a way that also gives us agency, right? I think part of the challenge here is, let's say you're hearing in the background, right? The Supreme Court did something on affirmative action, right? Um, sometimes there's a way in which kind of feel like, well, that's the last word. That's what more can I do? And what people don't do is typically draw the connection between their vote in this election coming up and what this and who is sitting on those courts. There's often a disconnect there, and as you said, Alex, you could argue that it is very intentional. And so, part of what we're trying to do is not only educate folks about what's happening, but help them to see the connectivity between their vote in this election and in every election, and who's sitting on those courts making those decisions.
And what I find fascinating and eye-opening about the report that's come out with your two organizations is that it dispels the myth that this is an unintended byproduct of conservatism. They're not really going after the black community. It just appears that way because we have other agendas and they are just an innocent bystander. No, you posit that this is an affirmative, directed strategy of suppression and of right and of an attack on one of our major communities in America, the Black community, one that deserves the opposite of what is happening to it. I mean, everybody should be concerned about the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act before our very eyes. Everybody should be concerned about the disenfranchisement of people in this country who have historically been disenfranchised in broad daylight by federal courts and the United States Supreme Court. And while you have to, as you said, activate um, your group, the rest of us have to be as upset about it and motivated by it as you are, or nothing's going to get done. Right? And so I like this report for a lot of reasons because I've always thought about things this way, but to see it so eloquently and efficiently laid out, I think is something that we have to get into the hands of more people. This election, for sure, we're all on pins and needles about what happens on Tuesday, but this movement of yours, this organization of yours, and with Court Accountability Action, has to be durable and live beyond the other side of Tuesday.
That's right.
We got a lot of work to do. We got 40 years of catching up with the Federalist Society, right? We're not going to do it overnight. You said you've been talking to people in the last few weeks. They've been talking to the people for the last 40 years.
That's it. That's it. You're absolutely right. And our mission, our goal, is to get to the point where we're having these conversations year round, 365 days of the year in our communities. Because you're absolutely right. This has been really a half century project of the far right. And in order for us to catch up, right? It's not just about voting in this election. It is about voting in this election, so make sure you go vote. But it is also about voting in every election, right? That's the key. That's the key. And then putting an agenda together after the election, and that's why we were so honored to work with Court Accountability.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you as a kind of the ending here, or one of the endings here, is knowing the information, identifying the problem is the first step of curing it, right? But then what people that are in our audience that are interested now, maybe hearing this for the first time. I'm a practicing lawyer and I kind of do this thing for a living. And some of the information that I learned in your writing was new to me, or at least the way it was pieced together. I thought, great. What besides just voting, what can they do about it? We've given them talking points on the street, but how can they kind of bake this into their lives? And what can they should they be volunteering? Should they be, you know what I mean? How do we get this thing off the ground? What would you recommend?
Well, I know Alex has some thoughts on this, but I'll just share one thing that we have been doing already. And that is we brought together just a few weeks ago a group of Black student leaders from across the country. So we brought, HBCU students, student government leaders together in a room. And we hosted a summit and a town hall to really understand the policy priorities that they want to see the next president pursue. And court accountability was in that room. And what we did in that room was we said, look, court reform has to be a part of this agenda. And these young people, actually, I should say we said it, the young people, and I am young, so maybe I shouldn't say they. We, the young people, decided that court reform would be a critical part of the agenda that we are going to pursue as a coalition of young people post-election, right? And so, I think part of this is making sure that when we're sitting down and crafting a Black agenda, when we're sitting down and crafting agenda items that we want to see the next president and Congress pursue, that court reform has to be part of that conversation. That's part of it.
Yeah, and just on top of that, and building off of it, when we work as hard as we are working to elect people to represent us in government, they need to deliver for us, right? So, as Democrats across the country campaign now on reproductive freedoms, on restoring voting rights, they need to be prepared to wield the power that they win, if they do win, to deliver for us. And they have bigger obstacles than they have ever had before because of these courts, because of the entrenchment of minority power in other elements of our government. And so they need to be willing to wield that power to break through those obstacles by doing things like getting through the filibuster, by when they work to codify protections for reproductive access, take into account what the court is almost certain to do to strike that stuff down, and to be willing to stand up to it. And so, yeah, I mean, get involved. There's lots of great organizations doing work like this. Check out YBlock, come on to Court Accountability. We just started a new Substack newsletter. We also work with a lot of great groups like Move On and Indivisible and Common Cause, groups that for years now have been, building huge movement power and that really understand the connection between the need for court reform and hard oversight to get to the bottom of this corrupt scheme and the issues that really mobilize and motivate the people that are doing the work behind those groups.
This is a great discussion, but this is a comma, not a period. This has to move forward. And I agree with you. The first thing I'd like to see Madam President-elect Kamala Harris do, with her hopefully being swept in with long coattails, is to respond to the United States Supreme Court and reverse many of their decisions by getting legislation passed, including strengthening and restoring the Voting Rights Act. Let's get that. If people are like, wow, we're just sit back idly and let the Supreme Court do all these things, tear down church and state, remove a woman's right to choose, take away voting rights. Yeah, there's an answer to it. You have to have, at the right moment, you have to have a Congress that's aligned with your morals and your values and your president and can get things done to reverse these terrible Supreme Court decisions. Otherwise, the Supreme Court becomes a super legislator, right? And they're passing the laws, and there's nothing we can do about it. There is no checks and balance in that world. We got to restore it. And it starts, as we've all said at the beginning of this show today, it starts with
I mean, you said it, right? I grew up in the Black church, so I'll just say amen. Amen to that. Here's what I think, I would hope folks would take away from this, right? Is that we have agency. We are not we don't have to be the perpetual victims of the Supreme Court. We can reform and reimagine this court. We have the power in our hands, and we can hold our elected officials accountable to that agenda. And that's what we want to encourage everybody listening to really take to heart, that you have a role to play in this. And if you care about racial justice in this country, I know many of your audience are folks who deeply, deeply care about the future of racial justice in America. We see that it's under attack every day. We see candidates running around the country, riling folks up around an anti-racial justice agenda. It's a moment where racial justice stands at the precipice. If folks care about it, they've got to care about these issues. They've got to care about the courts.
Amazing stuff, Abdul. Thank you so much for joining us here. Really grateful for your leadership, for your partnership on this report, but in general, can't wait to keep working with you and building this movement together.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.